Okay, let's unpack this. You sent over some really fascinating material here. It's all about how societies reacted to the huge changes from the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1750 to 1900.
That's right. Yeah, a period of massive upheaval. We've got sources on reforms, unions, new ideas like Marxism, even what was happening in China and the Ottoman Empire.
Right. So the goal here, our mission, is really to distill what matters. Yeah. Find the core drivers, maybe some surprising bits, and what it all means for, understanding things today. You mentioned wanting a quick but solid grasp, avoiding feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. That's the plan, to cut through the complexity a bit.
Perfect. Let's dive right in then.
Okay. Well, what strikes you immediately is just how deep these changes went. It wasn't just factories and machines. It really fundamentally altered how people lived, worked.
Even thought about society, right?
Absolutely. Their whole worldview was shifting.
So let's start at the ground level. The sources paint a pretty stark picture of daily life for working people. Long hours, low pay, really tough conditions.
Yeah, grim stuff.
It's no surprise people started demanding change. What were some of those first responses? How did people initially push back?
Well, initially it was often about just voicing the hardship,
Yeah.
The sheer difficulty of life, those incredibly long days, the minimal pay it naturally created this powerful desire for something better.
So that basic discontent became the engine.
It really did. It fueled all sorts of different attempts at change that we start seeing.
Okay, so the material mentions specific types of reform. Political, social, educational, urban. Let's take those one by one. Politically, expanding voting rights seems huge.
Oh, absolutely pivotal.
How did that shift things for political parties? Suddenly they had this whole new group, the working class. Think about it. What's a good example of how that played out?
Well, think about it practically. When more working class men get the vote, parties that maybe only cared about landowners or the wealthy, they suddenly have to listen, right?
They need those votes.
Exactly. So in Britain, for instance, you see both conservatives and liberals starting to talk about and even enact social reforms,
Yeah.
factory rules, public health stuff. Why? Because they needed to win over these new voters. It fundamentally changed their priorities.
Makes sense. And beyond politics, workers also organized socially. What did that look like early on? What were they trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, life was incredibly unstable. You could get sick, injured, lose your job just like that.
No safety net.
Right. So they formed their own groups, mutual aid societies. Think of them like early insurance pools, maybe. Members paid in regularly, and then they could get help if they were sick or for funeral costs, things like that.
Yeah, you build community too, I imagine.
Definitely. A sense of solidarity. We're all in this together, facing the same struggles.
Okay, then education. Compulsory schooling for kids, 6 to 12, becomes common in Europe. The source even connects us to our 5-day school week.
Yeah, interesting link, isn't it?
What was driving that? Was it purely about, wanting better educated people, or were there other, maybe more practical economic things going on?
That's a really good question. And while, sure, maybe some people wanted a more informed public, the sources strongly suggest a big economic push.
Ah, okay.
The second industrial revolution needed a different kind of worker.
Yeah.
People who could read, do basic math, understand instructions. So compulsory education was partly about creating that workforce.
Building human capital for the new factories.
Pretty much. Less purely altruistic, perhaps, and more about the needs of the changing economy.
The cities themselves. Rapid growth created huge problems. The source says, dangerous and stinky. Very evocative.
Huh. Yes, it paints a picture, doesn't it?
What kind of urban reforms happened, and were there downsides to those early fixes?
Well, the sheer speed of growth just overwhelmed everything. Sanitation was a nightmare. Think sewage in the streets, contaminated water. So eventually, governments started investing in proper sewer systems, clean water supplies, huge public health improvements. But, as one source points out rather dryly, this often just meant shifting the pollution,
How so?
moving it downstream, basically. So, one city's solution became another town's problem downriver. A classic case of unintended consequences, perhaps.
Right. So fixing it here, but creating issues elsewhere. Okay, these individual reforms are important, but then we get to more organized resistance, labor unions. Before they were legal, the power was all with the factory owners.
Right. Hugely skewed. An individual worker had almost no bargaining power.
So how did unions change that balance? What were their main goals, and how did they try to achieve them?
The rise of legal unions was a game changer. By banding together, collective action workers suddenly had leverage. They could negotiate as a group for better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions. That's collective bargaining.
And their main weapon.
The strike. The threat of withdrawing their labor-stopping production was the key way they pressured employers. Strength in numbers, really.
And these unions grew massive, didn't they? Millions of members in Britain, Germany, the U.S. by the late 1800s. Some even turned into political parties. The German Social Democratic Party is mentioned.
Yes, that's a fascinating evolution.
What was the thinking there, going from a workplace focus to full-on politics?
Well, I think there was a growing realization that, while strikes and negotiations could win concessions, fundamental change required political power.
Changing the rules of the game itself.
Exactly. To really alter laws about working conditions, property, the whole economic system, you needed to influence the government directly. So the German SPD, for example, grew out of these workers' groups aiming to win elections and pass laws that reflected, well, Marxist ideas about social ownership.
Okay, speaking of ideologies, Karl Marx. His name really looms large over this whole period. The sources say he saw the harsh side of capitalism in Britain. What was his basic argument against it? What did he think would happen?
Marx's core idea was that capitalism, while amazing at creating wealth, was built on exploiting workers and was inherently unstable. He saw the owners, the bourgeoisie, profiting by taking surplus value from the workers, the proletariat.
Surplus value being?
Essentially, the difference between what a worker produces and what they get paid. Marx believed this basic conflict between the owners and the workers would eventually lead to a revolution. The workers would overthrow the system.
And he and Engels called their ideas scientific socialism in the Communist Manifesto. What did they mean by scientific? What pattern did they think they discovered in history?
Scientific was key for them. They argued it wasn't just wishful thinking or a moral complaint. It was, they believed, a rigorous analysis of how societies change. They saw history moving in predictable stages, driven by class struggle.
From feudalism to capitalism.
And inevitably, they argued towards communism. The science was based on historical materialism, the idea that economics drives history, and this concept of dialectics, focusing on conflict driving change.
Got it. And these core groups, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, who were they exactly in this industrial world, and why were they in conflict?
Okay, so the bourgeoisie owned the means of production, the factories, the machines, the land, everything you need to make stuff.
The owners.
Right. The proletariat were the workers who didn't own those things. All they had to sell was their labor, their time and effort to survive.
So their interests were opposed.
Fundamentally, according to Marx, the owners want maximum profit, meaning low wages, maybe cutting corners on safety. The workers want the opposite: better pay, safer conditions. Marx saw this clash, this class struggle, as the absolute engine driving historical change.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. These reactions weren't just in Europe, right? The sources also look at China and the Ottoman Empire trying to modernize because of the growing power of these industrial nations. China first, what pushed them into dealing with powers like Britain?
Well, China had tried to limit trade, keep Europeans at arm's length, but the British East India Company found a product they could sell in huge amounts: opium.
Ah, the Opium Wars.
Exactly. It caused massive addiction problems and flipped the trade balance against China. When the Qing government tried to crack down and stop the opium trade,
Britain reacted militarily.
they did, using their superior naval power.
Why were those wars such a turning point? What were the immediate results for China?
They were decisive because they just brutally exposed China's military weakness against an industrialized Britain. The immediate result: unequal treaties. China was forced to open ports, pay reparations, give up territory like Hong Kong, and grant foreigners special legal status.
Extraterritoriality.
Right. They weren't subject to Chinese law. It was the start of a period often called the Century of Humiliation, with increasing foreign influence and a weakened dynasty.
So in response, China tried the self-strengthening movement. What was that about, and why didn't it quite work? The loss to Japan is mentioned as a big blow.
The idea behind self-strengthening was Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for practical use. Basically, adopt Western military and industrial tech, but keep traditional Confucian culture and government intact.
Sounds reasonable on the surface.
But it faced huge problems: resistance from conservatives in the government, lack of central coordination. It was very piecemeal. And then the war with Japan in 1895, Japan had modernized much more thoroughly and quickly.
And China lost badly.
Devastatingly. It showed that just bolting on some Western tech wasn't enough. Japan's comprehensive reforms had made them the regional power, and China's efforts looked totally inadequate.
Okay, turning to the Ottoman Empire, called the sick man of Europe. What was causing their decline relative to industrial nations?
Very similar story in some ways. Like China, they hadn't kept up with European industrial and technological advances. This meant a weaker military, loss of territory, especially in the Balkans, and becoming economically dependent on European loans and trade.
Internal issues, too.
Oh, yes. Corruption, inefficiency, and strong resistance to the kind of deep reforms that were probably needed.
So they also tried defensive industrialization with the Tanzimat reforms? How did these compare to China's self-strengthening? The sources mention factories, law codes, education.
The Tanzimat reforms were generally seen as, well, more comprehensive, more far-reaching than what China initially tried. Yes, they built factories, adopted some tech, but they also went further.
In what ways?
They significantly reformed the legal system based on European models, new commercial codes, penal codes, and they tried to create a more modern, centralized education system, moving away from purely religious schooling in some areas. It was a broader attempt to remake the state itself.
And this led to new groups like the Young Ottomans. What did they want? And what about that brief constitution? That seems like a flicker of something different.
The Young Ottomans were intellectuals, reformers, who actually felt the Tanzimat didn't go far enough. They were influenced by European liberalism and wanted a constitutional monarchy, an elected parliament to check the Sultan's absolute power.
And they briefly got it.
For a moment, yes. In 1876, a constitution and parliament were set up. But the Sultan suspended them very quickly just a couple of years later when war with Russia provided an excuse.
So what does that whole episode tell us?
It really highlights the immense difficulty of reform, doesn't it? You have these new ideas pushing for change, but powerful traditional forces, the Sultan, the established elites, push back hard against anything that limits their power. Reform was precarious.
Ultimately, even though the Tanzimat was maybe more ambitious than China's effort, the Ottoman Empire still collapsed eventually. So comparing China and the Ottomans, what are the main takeaways? What's a common thread in their struggles?
I think a key lesson is that just grabbing Western technology wasn't the answer. Real sustainable modernization seemed to require deeper changes, political reforms, legal reforms, shifts in social structures. And both empires faced enormous internal resistance to that kind of fundamental change.
A clash between tradition and the demands of this new industrial world order.
Exactly. The underlying challenge, perhaps, is just how hard it is for established non-industrial societies to adapt quickly when the global power balance shifts so dramatically towards industrial nations. That tension-preserved tradition or embrace disruptive change was something neither navigated successfully in the long run.
So as we sort of wrap this part up, it's crystal clear the Industrial Revolution wasn't just tech. It fundamentally reshaped everything.
Everything. Society, politics, ideology.
We see the push for workers' rights, the rise of unions, powerful new ideas like Marxism challenging capitalism itself, and these huge struggles in places like China and the Ottoman Empire trying to adapt. You really see the roots of our modern world being laid down here.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting for you, the listener, is to think about those patterns. How do societies react to massive disruptive change? Are there parallels today?
With things like AI, globalization.
Precisely. Are we seeing similar tensions, similar debates about how to organize society, how to distribute wealth and power that echo back to this period? What are the recurring themes?
Yeah, it makes you think. And of course, this deep dive has really just scratched the surface. You might be wondering more now about specific labor laws or the different flavors of Marxism or the longer-term impact of those modernization attempts.
All really fascinating paths for further exploration on your own.
Definitely. So what's the final takeaway here? Hopefully, you've got a clearer picture of this absolutely pivotal time, maybe seen some connections you hadn't before, had a few aha moments.
And it's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that progress, change, it's rarely smooth. It always sparks reactions, counter-movements, attempts to shape the future. Thinking about how people responded back then, maybe it gives us a bit more perspective on the huge transformations happening all around us right now.